my talk today, when I checked again, when I prepared my presentation, I started preparing the presentation, I realized that the title of my talk does not include the word metaphor. And I was like, whoa, that's probably the first time that I managed to not put the word metaphor in the title of my talk, which is, you know, actually, I am going to talk about metaphor today. And in particular, I thought my talk could be structured in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about theory and terminology and problems and methods associated with studying how metaphors work in multimodal communication. And then in the second part, I'm going to report an empirical study that I conducted with colleagues on metaphor and multimodal communication. So let's see. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. So in the past 20 or 25 years, let's say, there has been an increasing attention to the way metaphors are used beyond language, right? So even within the cognitive linguistic framework, which basically is the main framework where metaphors are studied since the 80s, the focus of the attention gradually shifted, let's say, or at least started to include a wider range of topics associated with metaphors. So not only how metaphors are expressed in words through language, but also how are they manifested in other modes, in other ways beyond language, you know, such as gestures, images, music, and so on. And this is a definition of what multimodal, the so-called multimodal metaphors are, given by Charles Forceville. Metaphors whose target and source, so basically the two terms, the two parts of the metaphor, are each represented in a different mode. They can be called multimodal metaphor, yeah? And so the question then is, what counts as a mode, yeah? And Forceville continues saying that there are, you know, different modes could be pictorial signs, written signs, spoken signs, gestures, sounds, music, smells, tastes and touch, and so on. So whenever a metaphor crosses, let's say, two concepts, each one expressed in one of these modes, so in two different modes, then the metaphor is multimodal. Yeah, and usually multimodal metaphors are contrasted with so-called monomodal metaphors. So metaphors where both terms are within the single mode, are expressed within the same mode. Yeah. And here on the right, you have a couple of examples from different genres. You know, you have an advertisement on top where you have the Listerine mouthwash, which is displayed as if it was a bomb somehow, yeah, suggesting that it's very effective in killing all sorts of bacteria and so on. And then you have an example here below of a political cartoon or an illustration in which you have an ATM merged with a confessional, you know, and both these multimodal messages, both these messages have elements that belong to language, so they have written words as well as pictorial signs, so they are considered to be multimodal. While these, for example, the last image on the bottom, you have, it's a famous photograph, artistic photograph, but you don't have any words, and so it counts as probably as a monomodal metaphor, you know, and you have the body of the woman, which resembles a musical instrument, and so on. Now, the problem is because metaphor and multimodality as well are are topics that are typically addressed by scholars and by students that come from very different backgrounds. Yeah, I think it's crucial to have a common jargon, a common terminology to talk about these issues, like what does modality means and so on, because otherwise there is not mutual comprehension. And for example, here there is a problem when we talk about modes and modalities. In cognitive linguistics, for example, we tend to use these two words as synonyms. Yeah? However, modality typically in cognitive science, for example, in many of the disciplines where many of you might belong, modality triggers the idea of sensory modality. The sensory modality meaning the sensory channel through which we perceive something. A sensory modality can be sight, a sensory modality can be touch, can be hearing, and so on. So this modality word is typically used in cognitive science and psychology to refer to sensory channels through which we perceive external stimuli, and not to refer to the system of signs that we use to represent a message. And so here then there is a problem, because if we talk about modality in two different ways, on one hand as if it in terms of sensory modalities, and on the other hand in terms of system of signs through which we represent a message, then we have problems, because, for example, we perceive through sight, through vision, so through the same sensory channel, we perceive written language, but also pictures, but also gestures, and so on. So are metaphors expressed through written words, pictures, and gestures are all expressed in the same modality? There is a bit of a problem. So in this perspective, then an image like this is a visual metaphor if we refer to the sensory modality through which we perceive it, because we perceive it through sight, we see it. Yeah, this is a visual metaphor because we see it, right? Even though there are words, but there are written words, we see them. This is a visual metaphor because we see it. Yeah. This is a visual metaphor, it's a gesture, but we see it, we perceive it through sight. So it's through the modality of sight. Yeah. This is a visual metaphor. This is is also a visual metaphor. This is a visual metaphor. This is a Pixar short movie. These are all technically within the same modality if we refer to the sensory channel through which we perceive these messages, right? So I think it's crucial to distinguish between mode and modality, and in particular, it might be useful to use the term modality when we talk about the processing, the cognitive processing of a message, of a metaphor. Yeah? When we talk about the way we process, we perceive, we talk about the way we process a message, we interpret and we comprehend it. So the cognitive processing has to do with modalities, while the mode has to do with the structure of the message, the way it is represented. Yeah. And so there is a difference, between processing and structure. And I think we should talk about modalities in relation to processing and modes in relation to structure. And of course, when we talk about messages like metaphors or advertisements, when we talk about these messages that involve multiple modes, yeah, then how do we call these? If we cannot say multimodal, we should say multimode message, multimodic. We don't have a word. So we suggested with a couple of colleagues to call these polysemiotic forms of communication. So this message, for example, this text, is monomodal because is processed through vision, through the sensory modality of vision, but it's polysemiotic because it involves signs from the pictorial mode as well as from the written linguistic verbal mode. It has the word Lego, right? So it's polysemiotic, but it's monomodal. This is, for example, monomodal, perceived through sight, monosemiotic, because it has just one system of signs, which is the pictorial one. Yeah, it doesn't have any words, it doesn't have other signs. But then, of course, one could say, so what about something like this? What about an image like this, which is a literal representation of a metaphoric expression, it rains cats and dogs, right? So one would say, okay, so this, we perceive it through sight, so it's monomodal visual, yeah? And it has only one semiotic system of signs. It has one mode, you know, it's just pictures. There are no words, nothing in the structure of this message, right? So it's monomodal, monosemiotic. But then, you know, it's tricky to claim that, because in fact, the very moment we see this image, we probably realize and activate in our mind the associated metaphoric expression, it rains cats and dogs, you know. So where do we how do we claim, how do we say that language is involved heavily, you know, in the understanding of this image, if we say that it's monomodal, monosemiotic? So another aspect that needs to be taken into account when we talk about metaphor and multimodality or monomodality is not just the differentiation between cognitive processing and structure of the message, but also the differentiation between levels of analysis. So, and this is a crucial differentiation that has been always a core aspect of many cognitive theories of metaphor, starting from the very conceptual metaphor theory fathered by Lakoff and Johnson in 1980, where basically they distinguish between what is called a metaphoric expression, typically a linguistic expression, and a conceptual metaphor. So something that it belongs to the conceptual level, to conceptualization. And also later models of metaphor analysis and metaphor studies, such as the deliberate metaphor theory and more recent models, always take carefully into account the fact that metaphors are multidimensional phenomena that bridge various levels of meaning. At least they bridge the level of expression with the level of conceptualization, but also in various models, for example, in the DMT, Stein involves also a third dimension of meaning, which is the communicative dimension. And so on. So, and it's crucial to differentiate between expression and conceptualization. And when we cross these two variables, let's say, when we cross structure versus processing of a metaphor, and with the expression versus the conceptualization of a metaphor, yeah, then we can have four different quadrants, four different aspects on which we can focus when we do our analysis on metaphor and multimodality. And so we can look at the structure of the metaphoric expression For example, if we do that type of analysis, we will look at how the source and the target, so the terms of the metaphor, are rendered within one or more systems of signs. For example, in this image with the confessional and the ATM, we see that the expression, the pictorial expression, involves an ATM that is attached to a confession, to the side wall of a confessional. And so this is how the metaphoric expression, the structure of the metaphoric expression looks like. Yeah. At the conceptual level, so at a higher, more abstract level, this is where we construct actually the conceptual mappings. So where we abstract knowledge, and we maybe we get to one of the possible interpretation for this image, which could be like the ATM stands for the banks or the economy or money in general, and the confessional stands for church, or something more like religion, something like that. And so by us abstracting this type of knowledge, we can get to the interpretation of this expression and say, okay, so maybe the artist wanted to suggest that money is like a religion nowadays, or something like that, you know. And this is about the structure of the metaphor. When we look at the processing, then we are interested in what type of knowledge is mapped between the two terms of the metaphor. And if we look at the expression of the metaphor, then we realize that visually, in this image, for example, the similarity, like the comparison between the ATM and the confessional, is realized by means of visual resemblance between the side of the wall where the ATM is displayed and the wall of the confessional, where one would need to, you know, bend on the knees to talk with the priest, basically. So it's a visual resemblance. It's based on iconic mappings in a way, while at a more abstract conceptual level, the mappings there between, for example, the money is a religion, or banks are churches, something like that, their conceptual mappings are transferred and projected from one domain to another, like you know, the value of like the importance, the sacredness, the holiness of involved in religions are then taken by the source, by the, you know, the money, economy, and so on. So that's what the processing, the conceptual mappings at the conceptual level. Now, let me move this for a second. So one of the aspects that is typically mentioned when we talk about expressions, metaphoric expressions that can be realized in images and so on, one of the crucial aspects that it's considered to be important to detect a metaphor is this perceptual incongruity thing. So if you see this image, for example, sorry, I didn't put the animation on this photo, so it's overlapped, but it's okay. This image on the left here, it looks unexpected, yeah? So it has something that triggers our attention, and this is typically exploited, typically used in advertising, yeah? To capture our attention, the image needs to display something unexpected, something that is a violation from the expected visual scenario, right? So here you have a juice bottle stuck in the dirt. Can you still see my screen? Yeah, Okay. With the carrot sprouts on top, yeah? So the image that you see here on the right is what you would expect, you know, a bottle of juice, maybe with some carrots on the table and so on. But here on the left, you see something unexpected, and that triggers our attention. It's incongruous, yeah? And that is this incongruity is considered to be a crucial part for the construction of a metaphor, yeah? But do we always need something incongruous? Like, is this visual incongruity necessary and sufficient to determine whether an image can be defined as a metaphoric expression? Well, now let me get back to the, okay, now we can have this image. This image of this person jumping, yeah, doesn't have any incongruity in a way. He's just a, you know, an athlete jumping, like running and jumping, right? It doesn't look anything incongruous. But this image was actually included in a brochure for a university campus. And the authors who displayed this image in their analysis, they suggest that the image was included in the brochure in order to suggest to the students, yeah, that if you enroll at that university, then you will be able to overcome all the barriers and the obstacles in your life because of the knowledge that you will gain by getting a degree at that university. So in this case, the incongruity that triggers our ability to then construct a metaphor is not within the visual mode, is not within the picture. The incongruity is between the picture and the context of the university brochure for admissions at the university. Yeah. So the incongruity is in between the pictorial mode and the context where the picture is displayed. Yeah. So it's not necessarily within the image. And then, is this pictorial incongruity sufficient to say then, okay, here we have a metaphor? Yeah, that is a metaphor. Is it sufficient? I would say no, it's not sufficient, because there are many images, for example, where there is something visually unexpected, like a visual incongruity, something that you know, it triggers our attention visually, but then does not necessarily keep us involved in the construction of a metaphor that has conceptual mappings and so on. And these are possibly some examples. These are images that I found on Pinterest. And you can see here there are some closer examples. Here you can see, for example, that the artist played with the visual resemblance of objects, of two objects. You know, there is an eggplant and a balloon, or the mop and the wig, the salad and an umbrella, and they played with the visual resemblance of two objects, but not necessarily they wanted the viewers to construct a conceptual metaphor, you know. So the idea is that we see these and we're like, ah, that's funny, that's cute, look, they look alike, you know, the mop and the wig, they look similar. It's based on iconic mapping, you know, it's based on iconicity, it's based on visual resemblance, the long shape of the hair, the texture, and so on. But it doesn't mean anything necessarily, anything else at a higher, more abstract conceptual level. Of course, I have been showing this to some of my students, and then the more you let these images sink in, the more you think about these images, the more our brains are likely to try to find an interpretation that goes beyond the visual resemblance, you know. So some students told me, after half an hour maybe, they said, well, prof, but I think the mop and the wig, it could be perfect for a social campaign in favor of women emancipation, because it's against, you know, the women's labor, or I don't know, something like that. Or maybe they said the umbrella that has the salad thing, it could be perfect in an advertisement to promote um, eating more veggies, basically, because vegetables protect us from diseases the same way that umbrellas protect us from the rain. So the more we look at these images, the more we are likely to try to find a meaning that goes beyond the simple visual resemblance. Yeah, but this is not necessarily what was intended by the artists. So on one hand, there is iconicity, so there is a visual resemblance, a pictorial resemblance between two things. And on the other hand, at a conceptual level, in order to construct a metaphor, we need to integrate knowledge and to construct conceptual mappings. Yeah. And unless we have both of these aspects, I would say that the visual incongruity, the pictorial incongruity alone does not necessarily lead to a success, you know, to a metaphor construction, to the construction of a metaphor. So, if a metaphor is polysemiotic, yeah, incongruity is not necessarily manifested within one mode. It can be between the picture and the context, for example. And if it's in monosemiotic messages, when the incongruity is within the same semiotic system, the incongruity is not sufficient to allow us to say, this is a metaphoric expression. Because in order to be a metaphoric expression, the image needs to trigger the construction of a metaphor at a higher conceptual, usually more abstract level. And not all of the images that display visual incongruities then enable us to construct a conceptual metaphor. Okay, let's see, what time is it? Yes. Now, the second part of my talk, fast forward to a much higher degree of complexity within the genre of advertising still. Let's see if I can show you this short clip, which is an advertisement, multimodal, polysemiotic, moving advertisement. I will show it to you, and then I will explain the type of study that we conducted on based on this.
The ghost who walks, she's on the prowl for the man she loved. He cut her down and was no
Agua fresca de rosas. Adolfo Domínguez.
Okay, so this is an ad for a perfume that was aired in Spain. Oops. And with a couple of colleagues, this is the first author of the study. It was part of her PhD project, which I had the pleasure to supervise as an external advisor, an external supervisor. We basically wanted to see how to approach the analysis of such a complex metaphorical message like the clip that you just saw. You know, it has moving images, it has multiple semiotic systems because there are images that move, there are sounds, there are written words, there are spoken words. There is a lot of, there is the body language, like there are a lot of aspects involved. So how do we approach the analysis of such a complex message? How do we try to understand what people do when they see these multimodal polysemiotic messages? How do they construct metaphors therein? and whether, and how do different people construct possibly different metaphors. So what we did for start, we tried to understand what we needed to approach an analysis like this. We needed a theoretical model that could inform us about the stages that people undertake when they process or interpret this type of complex multimodal polysemiotic messages. We need to choose a method, and for the time being, we opted for offline processing methods. We opted for a think aloud paradigm, which is basically showing the clip and asking people to verbalize their thoughts while they, after they saw the clip. As opposed to online measures such as eye tracking, EEG, and so on, which is something that we are about to do. We were delayed for COVID, but we will do it. Then we need tools. We need identification procedures for identifying whether there are metaphors reliably, and we need a tool for analyzing the metaphors that people construct in these messages. And then we need to take into account possible sources of variation in the interpretation of these messages. So what we did, we used a think aloud task, a retrospective think aloud task. So we showed the clip to 30 Spanish participants, 30 English participants, 30 Persian participants, with the goal of exploring the narratives that they constructed when they verbalized their thought related to this advert, to this multimodal advert. So first, we showed the advert to the participants, and then 3 times, and then we collected their thought. We recorded their thought, basically. Then we had to transcribe, translate, and segment into clauses all of the texts, the oral texts that they produced when they verbalized aloud their thoughts. Then we had to prepare a coding scheme to annotate all of the clauses that were produced by the participants according to, a coding scheme that was based on a theoretical model, which we found, and I will briefly explain that. And it was a model basically describing the cognitive operation that people undertake when they process this type of messages. And then we analyzed the type of mental operation based on our classifications. Now, we annotated the clauses and checked inter-rate reliability, and then finally analyzed the type of mental operations performed by the 3 different groups of speakers and compared the metaphors that they constructed. What time is it? Ooh, okay. So the theoretical model that we adopted was developed by Lorena for her PhD project, and it was based on an existing model of visual metaphor processing in still images, which Lorena adapted to moving images. And the model, basically, broadly speaking, is divided into 3 macro categories of cognitive operation that people undertake when they process visual metaphors in print advertising. And the idea is that there is a type of cognitive operation which goes under the name of incongruity perception. It includes all of the thoughts about the recognition that something is going on in the image, that a literal reading of the image is not satisfactory, basically. And so the speaker realizes that there is something else going on. And then there is a phase of called the incongruity resolution, which is basically when they construct the metaphor, when they realize that there could be a figurative reading of this message that then maybe is more satisfactory. And then there is a third type of cognitive operation, a third phase, which is the contextual processing. Basically is when they recap and they evaluate the whole experience, and they give their own judgments about the message and so on. And our coding scheme was based on these 3 macro categories, and then subcategories, which we derived based on Lorena's research and on the previous, the model that I described before. So the macro categories are, you know, the irrelevant clauses. So when speakers say something like, oh, yeah, I'm sorry, what else? And so on. All of those clauses were annotated as irrelevant information. And then the first category, basically, it's where they basically describe what they see. And so based on the clip before, they would produce sentences such as, and the boat is wide, and she's like lounging on this boat in the middle of this body of water, and there are roses in the water, and stuff like that. And then there are clauses that participants produced that we annotated as conceptual integration and all the nested category within this macro category, which is where participants, you know, start to try to solve the incongruity. And so they start constructing the metaphors, yeah? And so, for example, they would say things like, hoping to attract the right fish in the sea, the right man from the sea, the roses are like the man that she wants to get with the perfume, and so on. You know, they would say something like this. And then there is the third phase, like the third type of cognitive operation, which is when they evaluate the whole message, and they say things like, so I mean, it's a good perfume ad, I can see it being successful to certain crowds, definitely has that appeal, and so on. Yeah. So we 2 independent annotators annotated all of the clauses produced by the 90 participants, 30 Spanish, 30 American, 30 Persian, which was a total of 1,341 clauses were annotated based on these 3 macro categories and all of the nested categories within these 3 macro categories, and achieved a good inter-rater reliability. And then we looked at the order in which these categories were distributed in the way people verbalize their thought, you know. And ideally we thought, okay, if the thinking process is linear, we would expect people to first describe what they see, then detect the incongruity, then resolve the incongruity, and then in the very end give an evaluation of the whole thing. So we would expect to see a linear progression in the order in which the categories appeared in the clauses, in the sentences that they produced. But instead, that was not the case. So in the recordings that we analyzed, people would jump from one cognitive operation to another, and then go back to describe something else that they saw, and then interpreting it, and then evaluating the ad, and then go back to describing another thing. And then, you know, they would jump from one thing to another. It wasn't linear at all. We also tried, because this was a retrospective think aloud task, so we showed the clip and then we asked them to verbalize their thought. And we thought, wait, but it could be the case that because they had to remember what they saw, then that's why they jumped from one type of operation to another. But actually, we found literature showing that there isn't much of a difference between retrospective think aloud tasks, which is when you see something and then you verbalize your thought, and concurrent think aloud task, which is when you talk while you see the stimulus. And also, research shows that in concurrent think aloud tasks, so when you have to talk while watching a stimulus, what you end up doing, basically, you end up describing what you see, and that's it. You don't integrate with your interpretation. You don't go much beyond what you see. So we realized, we tried actually both, but we realized that the retrospective think aloud task was a better match for our purpose, because we wanted people to think about what they saw and try to interpret the metaphors and so on. So to conclude, I think, yes. To conclude, let's see, we found some interesting associations between types of operations. These are actually the more detailed categories within these three macro types of cognitive operations. We found interesting association between type of speakers, so group of speakers, and type of mental operation, yeah, but not extremely strong. So the residuals analysis showed that, for example, Persian speaking participants were more likely to get involved in the second type, like in the incongruity resolution, in the metaphor construction type of operation, while Spanish participants and English participants were more likely to produce irrelevant clauses, and Spanish participants also trying to more likely to try to understand the communicative intention of the of the creative agency. And in terms of metaphors also, we saw that indeed different groups tend to construct different metaphors. For example, in the Persian group, there were no participants like constructing metaphors like the roses are the items that she wants, or the woman is a fisherman, or roses are fish. Most of the participants in Iran constructed the metaphor men are roses. The man, like the roses in the sea that she is fishing are men. Men are roses. It was interesting to see that, while this metaphor was much less present in the other two groups. And I think my time is really up. There is more variety of metaphors in the texts produced by Spanish participants and English participants compared to the Persian ones, and so on. So to conclude and summarize, metaphor construction in multimodal adverbs does not follow linearly the categories identified in our adapted model. So it's going back and forth between types of cognitive operations. It remains to be tested what happens with online measures like eye tracking, EEG, and so on. The type of mental operation that we identified can reliably apply to the classification of clauses. We noticed an interesting but difficult to interpret difference between the use of categories in the three groups. And people speaking different languages and from different cultures construct different metaphors when exposed to the same stimulus. So to conclude, we need to clarify terminology across disciplines. I think it's very important for the sake of communicability across disciplines. It's important to keep in mind the distinction between structure and processing of metaphor in monomodal and multimodal messages. We need to keep in mind the distinction between dimensions of metaphors, at least between the expression and the conceptualization. And when exploring the way we make sense of multimodal polysemiotic messages, probably multiple methods are needed to combine insights from different methods. And we need to pay attention also to the sources of variation that may be involved in our way to process and understand metaphor. We looked at cultural variation, but there are many other sources of variation that may affect the way we understand and interpret metaphor. Thank you.